Why do the Psalms and hymns make me feel better? That was a question from one of my viewers. Stay tuned. I'll give you the answer. I received an excellent question from a young man. This was his question. Why is it that listening to or reading the Psalms or hymns makes me feel better? He wanted to make sure I knew that was not a rhetorical question. He wanted to understand the science and the reason behind it. So today, let me unpack that a little bit for you. I believe it's tied to what we're going to call the Davidic arc. But before I give you that, let me back up and remind you just a little bit about how our brains work. So deep in our brain, we have the limbic system, and that's where learning and memory is. That's where our fight and flight responses kind of get originated, but it's also where the amygdala is. And so that's where depression and anxiety, fear, those things live and hang out. And it cannot be on at the same time as our prefrontal cortex. Our prefrontal cortex is where empathy and altruism and thinking before you act and processing right and wrong and thinking through reward versus consequence. All of that, what we call executive function, is here in our prefrontal cortex. And because our limbic system cannot be on at the same time as our prefrontal cortex, our brain kind of has to make a choice. Are we going to hang out in over here with depression and anxiety, or are we going to hang out in the front with empathy and altruism and higher order reasoning and executive function? Well, what kind of controls which is going to come on or off is the anterior cingulate. It's this structure that's at the back of our prefrontal cortex that connects to our limbic system. So it's going to either upregulate the limbic system, like if somebody comes in and they're a threat and they're a danger, they're a stranger and they have a weapon, I don't need to be empathic in that moment. I need to run or fight or do something that's not, tell me about your mother. So but at the same time, you don't want to live there. That's not good for you. It's bad for your body. You're just going to be in a constant state of distress, and you won't be able to develop the empathy and the altruism and the higher order reasoning, the executive function associated with the prefrontal cortex. So in comes the anterior cingulate and tells us where we need to be. So back to that Davidic arc. This is why the Psalms and hymns and reading God's word and praying and all the spiritual disciplines. I have a video, I'll link that below on how the spiritual disciplines relate to mental health. But this is specifically what's happening in the Psalms. Most of the Psalms follow what I call the Davidic arc. And that's my term. But why I call it that is a lot of the Psalms, let's take Psalm 22 as an example. Psalm 22 starts out with, my God, why have you forsaken me? David starts his Psalms with, the world is dark, everything stinks. Lord, I don't know where you are, and I feel like my enemies are going to crush me. And then he goes through a process so that by the time he gets to the end, he says, but I know you're God. I know you're here. I know you will save me, and I know it'll be okay. Now, that's a really loose paraphrase of the Davidic Psalms, but it follows that arc. So this is what happens. In the beginning of those Psalms, it's going to validate what's going on in our emotional brain, that deep structure in the amygdala. It's going to say, yeah, those feelings are valid. And then it's going to take us through a cycle. That validation, by the way, is going to give us a little bit of oxytocin. And what that oxytocin does is it allows us to feel calm and more content. So it's already starting to create a little bit of a neurobiological, like iced tea on a hot day, but for the brain. And then as we go through the arc, we're going to move from that limbic system to our prefrontal cortex. We know this because studies on people who spend a lot of time in prayer and meditation have these really robust prefrontal cortex. They have a lot more density in the gray matter of that cortex and a lot more blood flow also. So we're going to we're going to quiet that limbic system where the anxiety and the depression and the fear and the distress is. And we're going to move then into closer to our prefrontal cortex. And we get that oxytocin with it. Just a little bit of a oxytocin spritz. It's not a bath like you get, if you're breastfeeding or other things that really create these huge surges of oxytocin, but you get just a little bit that helps you feel calm and content. And all of that is going to happen in that anterior cingulate cortex, which, by the way, there are scientists that believe that that's the part of the brain in which we connect with God. And isn't that fascinating that he would choose that spot that acts as the fulcrum that's kind of in between that limbic system and that prefrontal cortex? What a good God. So for this young man who asked this question, I hope this was helpful. I hope it breaks down the science of why the Psalms and the hymns also are very helpful. I look forward to more comments and more questions in the future. Until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you.